Um, Before we get started on our next panel, there's been a few programmatic adjustments in terms of time. The concurrent sessions will begin at 2:30 and they'll run to 3:40. So the concurrent sessions will go from 2:30 to 3:40. The plenary on the power of art will run from 3:50 to 5:10. The plenary on the 21st century landscape of injustice, that will run from 5:20 to 6:35. All right? And if you have any questions, please see one of us. So without further ado, we would like to I guess all the panelists are here. We would like to begin with what will be an electric and provocative and thought-provoking panel on the politics in the age of Obama, the power and limits of electoral strategies. And this panel will be moderated by activist and assistant professor at Princeton University, Kianga Taylor. So thank you.
Hey everyone, like Marco just said, this is the politics in the age of Obama, the power and limits of electoral strategies. My name is Kianga Yamata Taylor, and it's my pleasure to be able to introduce and moderate the impressive panel that we have today on such a critical topic as this. We have a full panel and a huge topic, and so I want to briefly introduce the panelists while drawing everyone's attention to the program for more in-depth background on their full body of work. But for the sake of brevity and time, I want to give brief introductions to each of them, make a few brief introductory comments, and then open it up for each of our panelists to speak for about 5 minutes as introductory remarks, and then we'll open up a more broad discussion that will include all of you and a hopefully meaningful dialogue between the panelists and the audience. To begin with, we have Che Rhymefest Smith, who is a Grammy Award-winning hip-hop artist and political activist here in Chicago. We have Kali Akuno, who was active with the late Chokwe Lumumba in Jackson, Mississippi, and who is also part of the 1% tax strategy. Amisha Patel, who is active in a Chicago organization called the Grassroots Collaborative. Yahuru Williams, professor and director of Black Studies at Fairfield University in Connecticut. And Rosa Clemente, former Green Party vice president candidate and PhD candidate at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. And like I said, I'm going to make a few brief introductory comments, hopefully to frame some of the discussion, and then we will kick off with Rhymefest. Securing the right to vote across the South was an obvious focal point of Freedom Summer in 1964 and the Civil Rights Movement more generally. That right was intended to affirm the inclusion of African Americans into the American polity as active citizens in the making and shaping of local, state, and national politics. And since then, every election season, African Americans are implored by elder Blacks and many Black civic organizations to exercise the right to vote because so many people fought and died for that right. And while these advocates are invoking the general struggle across the South, they are also speaking poignantly about Mississippi and the events surrounding Freedom Summer. It is certainly true that Black and white activists and indigenous Black folk across the region gave their lives so that Black people could transcend their second-class citizenship. But to reduce that struggle simply to the act of voting, and not more robustly and broadly as a struggle for equality and freedom, is to invest too much in an enterprise that has delivered precious little to the vast majority of African Americans and exploited in general. right to vote, or even the need to protect, defend, and extend that right. But it is to recognize that while a heroic struggle was unfolding, demanding the franchise in the South, in the North and Western United States, where voting was legal and virtually unencumbered, the perils of poverty, unemployment, substandard housing, poorly funded schools, and police terrorism were defining features in the lives of non-white people, and for which no referendum or ballot could fully transform. This did not then, nor does it today, render the franchise irrelevant, but it does suggest that it is not enough to implore our people to vote because someone died for that right. Rather, we must also ask, for what and for whom are we voting? The two parties that reign over the American political system have demonstrated utter contempt for African Americans. The Republican Party's boorish racism has been on display for some time and hardly needs to be said. But the Democratic Party, even with a black man at its helm, celebrates its lack of a black agenda as a badge of honor to demonstrate the absence of African American influence over the direction of the party. The absence of such an agenda is not a passive omission, but it is actively injurious. In Chicago, for example, in this city, Mayor Rahm Emanuel, the former chief of staff for Obama and a high-ranking operative in the Democratic Party, after receiving 60% of the black vote to get into office, proceeded to close 52 schools on the south and west sides of Chicago, the largest number of school closings in a single act in American history. These types of attacks on the public sector and the people who rely on the public sector, who are overwhelmingly black and brown, is happening in every city in the United States. These cuts are also happening while the rich continue to grow unprecedented wealth. The reality and disgust with it have opened up the possibility of electoral challenges as the differences between the two parties become increasingly indistinguishable. From Kasama Sawant in Seattle to Chokwe Lumumba in Jackson, Mississippi, and other electoral challenges that are underway now. How can we use the electoral platform to raise the issues that affect ordinary people while also creating the space and opportunity for new electoral formations and organizations and parties to arise and develop? Moreover, how will these electoral endeavors contribute to the necessary development of social movements that can challenge an economic and political order that prizes capital over human life? We still face many of the conditions that transformed SNCC activists in 1964 to black, brown, and white revolutionaries by 1968. And none of those issues are ever on the ballot. From US imperialism to record levels of poverty, to mass incarceration, to evictions and foreclosures. Their persistence demonstrate the limits of electoral politics, but in the process of building the kinds of movements needed to challenge these phenomena, we must ask what role can electoral challenges in the form of independent politics play in creating the kind of movement to make the better world we all seek possible. Thank you. Next. Next up, we have Rhymefest.
I want to thank you, Ms. Taylor, for having us, and thank you, IC, and to the distinguished guests on the panel. I'm glad that you all are here as well. The subject, politics in the age of Obama, I just had to think about, what it meant to me personally, and in my experience, you cannot have political social justice in politics in America as long as it costs $1 billion to be president. As long as it costs $1 billion to be in the running to be the president of the United States, you're not going to have the best candidate that cares about social justice. You're going to have the candidate that can raise $1 billion. And the candidate that can raise $1 billion more often than not does not care about social justice. They care about venture capitalism. As we lower down, I would challenge anybody to tell me on the south or west side of Chicago, a politician that got elected from the grassroots. What we have on the south and west sides of Chicago are helicopter politicians that hover over the community and give top-down policies. The community does not determine what the policies are, the politicians do, and they hand them down to the community. So the question then becomes, what do we do about it? What can we do about it? In my experience and my estimation, the issue is that those of us who are artists, those of us who are academics, those of us who are activists, and those of us who are all three in one, we all live too far apart to really make an effective move in politics. We say that it's media, but it's not media. We say that it's all these other things, except for the fact that we don't live in the same communities. So we're not working toward the same goals together in one space as a collective. What I find is that, you know, if Rosa Clemente lived around the corner from me, if you lived down the block from me, we would get together every week, and then the community would choose who we're going to run for alderman, who we're going to run for state rep, who we want to elect as a judge. We would work with and in a cooperative economic way. And this is another thing that is messing up our politics, is that these so-called capitalist companies, corporations that we like to call capitalists, they're really socialists. If you look at Tom Warner merging with another huge company, when they're running out of money, they merge. When they're running out of money, they buy each other out and they make deals with each other. But they sell us capitalism when they're being socialists in practice. So our communities need to barter gifts. Our talents need to barter and trade with each other and choose who our politicians are going to be. I think that this is the only way we can cure the ills of our community, which is bad quality education, mental health issues. With communities that are decayed and decaying, there's no way you can get good politics or good politicians. The politicians in Chicago are being chosen by who has the most money. So if you look at black politicians, most of the aldermen were selected, not elected. So when you look at their voting patterns, it's 85%, 100% with the mayor, because they were selected by the mayor, not elected by the community. Until we can figure out a better way than Section 8 and a better way than projects that are transient communities, we have to have stable neighborhoods of artists, activists, and academics, along with everybody else, to choose who our politicians are going to be. That's the only way to politically survive, is grassroots up, not helicopter down.
I'm going to apologize up front because I'm going to have to leave in a few minutes. I'm heading back to New Jersey to work with a group of young people who are contesting exactly what you're talking about, Rhyme Fest, in the Newark Public Schools, and that is the dismantling of public education, which should concern us all. When we look at charter schools, Teach for America, and the efforts that are underway to take away the very space where organizing took place in the 1960s. When we talk about Freedom Summer, one of the central features of that program was the Freedom School. But the Freedom School wasn't just about building basic skills and making students job ready. It was about organizing. It was about community intervention. It was about building and developing the capital in those communities to move forward a political agenda that would advance, allowing people to contest what Hassan talked about in Bloody Lounge, freedom politics, to contest for freedom politics. Harold Lasswell in 1958 gave a very simple definition of politics. Politics decides who gets what, when, and how. Marcus Pullman came around later on and said, you got to talk about black politics differently, black and brown politics, because you're looking at a different set of things that we want. But I want to talk about DNA. I want to talk about our dreams, how we nurture those dreams, and ultimately how we act to advance those dreams in public spaces where we're denied the very opportunity to use what should be the avenues to discuss what we want in terms of a black and brown agenda, what we want in terms of an agenda that speaks to deindustrialization, that speaks to health concerns in our community, that looks concretely at issues of And we can look again at Freedom Summer for a good example of this. What does the curriculum look like? One of the sisters at the end of the last session talked about, well, my problem is we never learn these things in schools. That's because the school board, which should drive curriculum, should be composed of parents and teachers and young people working in concert and learning those things that will allow them, again, to contest for these freedom politics that Hassan talks about. The problem is, and we dealt with this in Connecticut, we inherited him, unfortunately, from Chicago. We got Paul Vallis as our superintendent of public schools in Bridgeport, Connecticut. He came in and suspended the school board. That's not politics. That's destruction. Then Paul Vallis, of course, we know, went from New Orleans to Philadelphia, kind of like a typhoid Mary Pied Piper, dismantling public education. Now he comes back to be lieutenant governor, and people say, how does this happen? How do people helicopter in? Love the word, Ron Fest. Your boy, our boy Kanye, talked about college dropout. Let's look at what's happening now in terms of American public education, in terms of universities, and questions of affordability, questions of MOOCs. Where is the conversation going to take place if we allow those corporate interests, the Koch brothers, the Waltons, the boorish Republican Party, to dismantle the very space where so much activism happened on college campuses? The civil rights movement without women and without college campuses never would have taken place. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm going to be very brief because I like to engage more in kind of question and answer than kind of just speaking at people. And I'm in a place where we've had a pretty intense 6-year run of trying to advance some things in Jackson, Mississippi. And due to some unforeseen circumstances, we face a new set of challenges. But the new set of challenges really give us a good time to reflect and learn on that 6 years and what we did right and what we did wrong. And we did a little bit right and we did a little bit wrong. And so we're trying to figure that out. But to speak directly to some of the issues in the write-up for this session, and for this I'm speaking for myself. No, I'm not speaking for the Malcolm X grassroots movement or anybody else. But it's never been my position that elections are going to, you can vote your way to freedom. That is not going to happen, not in the system that we've been socialized and which constricts our world. That's not going to happen. Building the social movements, I believe, is primary. That was the primary thing around us pushing and articulating the Jackson Kush plan. It was the primary thing around putting Chokwe Lumumba up to run for office, was to be a voice and an advocate for those social movements and not the other way around. And the social movements in this era, I think, have to do a couple of different things if they're going to engage in the political arena around electoral politics. Number one, be clear about what you want. I mean, crystal clear about what you want. Be clear about your capacity to achieve it to the extent that you possibly can in the time frames that are allowed, you know, by the, be it a 4-year system for most in terms of mayor and governor, 2 years in terms of Congress, and, you know, some things like that. Be very clear about what you want, what time frame you intend to achieve it. And I think another critical thing is the social movements. We have to be really focused, I think, in this present era on creating alternative economic policy and alternative economic structures. And in our case, that's something we really particularly been focused on, because we've been trying to grapple from our vantage point, particularly since Katrina, looking at the black population moving from being not just surplus but disposable, right? And how do we, in the context of neoliberalism, not just in the context of Obama, but in the context of neoliberalism, how do we deal with that particular issue? I don't think it's still, from capitalism point of view, I think it's a question in search of an answer. But the mass incarceration strategy is kind of running out of steam on their behalf. It's too expensive to kind of maintain at the levels they've been trying to do it for the past 30 or 40 years. You already see a lot of reformist innovation that they're doing, particularly in the South, but that's going to run out of steam too. But you're still going to have a mass of black and Latino people who are unemployed and unemployable, and the system is going to have to do something with them. So we need to start coming up with that answer, not waiting for capital to come up with that answer. That's on us to organize. In our case, just to be specific around how we were looking at pursuing the mayor's office in particular. We had a set of concrete things that we were trying to accomplish within a 4-year period. We had no kind of extensive engagement on looking at 8 years for a number of different reasons. We can talk about that later, but in terms of the first 4 years, really we wanted to transform policy on a couple of different levels to enable the social movements to have more space to operate in our local context. And we basically wanted to create what we call a human rights regime to be supported by creating a human rights commission and the Human Rights Institute in particular, and the Human Rights Charter for the city. And within that, we were going to set up a number of different things to try to hold the different departments of city government accountable to human rights and international norms and standards. And particularly looking at how do we put the police department in the direct hands of the community in terms of it voting on its policy and its procedure, right? We were trying to make a radical break and come up with a radical experiment in that particular way. The second piece was really to create participatory structures around participatory budgeting and creating more space for, in particular in our case, for the People's Assembly to have some more say-so, particularly around the economic policies of the city, right? Not to be formally incorporated into the city, just to be clear, we thought that would be problematic and wind up binding the People's Assembly in ways that earlier kind of articulations of that with block committees and some of the things that we saw that happened in Atlanta in the early 70s, we didn't want to repeat that history. So it was kind of walking a fine line of trying to find what is that balance of maintaining the autonomy of the People's Assembly, but also having it being able to push on city government, right? I'm not saying that we found it, but that was the articulation, and we're still going to struggle for that. And then the third, I think the most important thing for us was creating the policies to create what we call a solidarity economy and the push for economic democracy, right? And that was really setting up a set of policies that we would transform how the city did its contracting and transform all of the different procurement policies of the city to make them sustainable on the one hand and totally locally focused and centered on the other to incentivize the development of cooperative enterprise and economics within the city. Those are the three things that we had. That's three major things, but those are three things that we had we felt that we can do with the power we had vested in the community and our allies and the social movements that we could do in our 4 years. So we were very clear on that and we were pursuing that agenda. Now, some things that you run into in terms of being very clear, we knew the city was in a bit of trouble with the feds over its water treatment piece. The EPA slapped a consent decree on the city of Jackson, and they've been talking about it for about 20 years, but they finally slapped it on Jackson in 2011 and they negotiated in 2012. This is before Chokwe assumed office in 2013. We did not know the depth of the threat that posed to the democracy of Jackson, such as it is, until we got in office, right? A lot of that information, even though he was on city council, even though he was privy to some information, the way the strongman mayor, and I say man because there's only been men who've been mayor in Jackson, the way the strongman mayor have operated is that they basically can only share what they want to city council. And so Chokwe was really out in the dark in a lot of respects and didn't get a full understanding, or we didn't get a full understanding until we had the paperwork in our hands. And then we were challenged with, okay, if we don't deal with this, in about 5 years' time, we will be in the same position relative at least to water that Detroit was, with the state controlling the water or the federal government controlling the water. So we were faced with how we're going to deal with the privatization or at least the regionalization of the water supply immediately. And water is the greatest asset that the city of Jackson presently owns, because it doesn't just supply water for itself, it pretty much supplies water for the greater Jackson metro region, right? Even though they pay a differentiated rate that's cheaper than what the city people of Jackson pay on average in the suburbs. So that's an issue of equity that we got to deal with and fight for. But we got hit with that, and it forced us to kind of readjust some of our pieces in terms of looking at the timeline, and it put us in a square thing with, well, how do we deal with conflict aspect of New York?
Next we have Alicia.
it's amazing to get to follow that. I'm going to talk a little bit about what we're trying to do here in Chicago. It's a lot more in the stage of thinking and experimentation at this point, but we're trying to figure out, I think, a few important questions. So I want to anchor this conversation a little bit about what's happening in the city. Like many other parts of the country and frankly the world, right? Chicago is absolutely a tale of two cities and a growing amount of inequity happening where policies continue to benefit the wealthy and the elite in the city. And it's very much connected to privatization and austerity pushes, right? The excuse of why Black and Latino workers and why our communities are being decimated is that we need more money. And of course, we all know where the money actually is going and that that's not the real issue. And in this context, right, there's been a very depressed state around possibility around electoral organizing and politics. In a lot of ways, I think for the last 30 years, we've been mourning still the loss of Harold Washington and unable to articulate, let alone organize for a different perspective on what's possible of reclaiming power in the city. When I think about why don't we actually run this town? Why don't we run this entire state, given who makes up the city, who makes up the state? And it's because we haven't actually, in my perspective as organizers, really imagined as boldly and as powerfully as possible of what that could look like, the fact that that actually is possible, and then how do we get there? And I think part of what we're trying to play with here at Grassroots Collaborative and our kind of connected political organization is, how do we combat the hopelessness that exists in our communities across the city through deep political education, but also building localized political infrastructure in neighborhoods across the city. I think for too often, folks, if we can figure anything out, we try to, maybe there's a candidate running for alderman for our city council that is interesting. That we want to try to get behind, but we do this work in sort of in a vacuum, and we're not building our own infrastructure that's separate from those candidates. So even if we actually win office, what happens when that person gets into office and gets sort of set up in a corrupt system when we don't have any infrastructure that's built up to hold that elected official accountable, right? They can claim all of us as their people, and yet more and more with their actions, they're no longer ours. Right, and so part of what we're trying to experiment with is what does that look like? What could we do in what year is this? 14, thank you. I was gonna say 2011, I don't know where I am. So in 2014, our city election's coming up in February of 2015. What's possible in neighborhoods across the city when there's clearly a hunger for change? People are ready for something different to happen. But for us, it's really key that we can't, it's not just about, and I think, as has been said before, it's not about voter registration alone, right? How are we building the deep political education and consciousness? How are we building independent politics to really, and new structures, right, that can actually carry that vision forward? So I think a couple of things, and to me, I think the question that we've really, on the left, we've really seeded this idea, and I think that's where Jackson and other places are such amazing inspirations, is that we've really seeded this idea of governance, right? The fact that working people in this country can actually have the right to govern our lives and our cities and our communities. So what does it mean if we try to take that back? And I've been thinking a lot about Democrats. Democrat, we know the reality of the fact of the lack of politics and positioning around the issues that people in power in the city display. But I think about Democrats, right? Do they actually? Democrats may campaign differently than Republicans, but do they govern differently, right? What would that look like to actually govern differently? One of my colleagues was saying this earlier today of what Republicans do is they shut down government to appease the base, and Democrats shut down our base to appease government. And I think it's really profound, right? How are we actually? What are we doing to actually? What's being done to our communities around our power and our ability to take control of our lives and our communities, and what then as organized people can we do to fight back against that? What does that look like? And there's absolute limitations within 501c3s and C4s and all of that. And I think what we're interested in doing, based on 15 years of relationships here in the city of community organizers and grassroots leaders across the city, how, given even those challenges of those infrastructures, can we push? And can we push further and further to the left to really challenge the way that things look in our city and our neighborhoods, challenge our ideas and notions of what's possible in terms of our power and our vision for what this city looks like, and how do we imagine boldly? What does that look like? Because we're phone banking folks, like people are hungry for something. How do we actually build the infrastructure that can last for the long term, despite all the ways that oppression makes us feel like we have no power? And it's not just a feeling, right? That's a very deliberate in terms of how we're being told what we can do and take action around. So I think that's a lot of what we're trying to figure out is what does that deep political education look like in our communities? How can we demand and imagine something different? And really, really kind of create independent politics that works for people in the city, that imagines something different, but also really pushes the possibility, leads to results that actually people can feel. I think that we often talk about issues and issues matter, but I think it's really about what are people's lived experiences like in the city, and are we creating what do we need to do to create a city that actually lifts up and reflects and meets the needs of the lived experiences of our people. So I think we're absolutely in an experimentation phase. We want to see what we can try and build and what sticks, and I think there's lots of questions about the limitations of electoral politics in this city for sure, but I also think that there's so much more that's possible, that examples of like what happened in Jackson really pushes our imagination and is critical for folks here in this city to imagine something different. Thanks.
How's everybody doing? All right. All right, we're all so serious and contemplating freedom. I love it. I love it. I'm in an interesting phase in my life, so I kind of want to, I didn't want to personalize it, but I think it'd be instructive, especially to the young people in the audience, to reflect, which I'm doing now, but talk about a little bit about, and very quickly, of course, why I decided to run the day Cynthia McKinney called me and said, everybody else has said no, will you run? And I was like, sure, why not? I don't have a job. Got fired again, and never gonna get a job in the nonprofit industrial complex since I've been smashing on that for so long. Can't live with my parents anymore. What am I gonna do? Let me run for vice president, why not? Because that's how you should always make that decision. But in reflecting on that, it's been 6 years. It'll be 6 years this July that here in Chicago, me and Cynthia McKinney got the nomination on the Green Party ticket, making us the first woman of color ticket in American presidential politics. So I love always coming back to Chicago. For the first 3 years after I was mad at the hip hop community, whose agenda I rode hard with, and who didn't ride hard with us and Cynthia and the agenda. I was pissed off at the Green Party, particularly those so-called white liberals and progressives who thought me and Cynthia were so radical that they took us off the ballot in 2 states. Imagine your own party takes you off 2 ballots, right? I was mad at everybody, just kind of like, here we come out with this agenda that should move people. But that's the first 3 years of the reflection. The next 3 years go, well, of course, we didn't have a social movement, like, where we just popped up and like, hey, me and Cynthia are running against Obama. Like, what does that mean? At that moment, it meant to me, thank you. We just needed 54 million more votes and we would have been all right. But I am so grateful for Cynthia and the Green Party in general for having what I call the audacity to attempt to mount an oppositional force to what particularly Black and Latino progressive and left people knew was a facade of bull crap coming from the Democratic Party, right? They knew that. So 6 years after that run, and then 3 years of reflection now in being able to become a historian and reflect and analyze and look at all this stuff, These are just a couple of things I'm thinking of. First, I think we're in a new phase, and we have to name it, of white supremacy, where it's no longer incumbent on white supremacy to have a white face, it can have a black and brown one. Right? I think there's a difference between people running for office, then winning office, then being able to govern. And right now, if anybody's interested in electoral politics, not only do we study Chokwe Lumumba and what happened in Jackson, we need to be very clear on what's about to happen in Newark, with Ras Baraka having become elected. Then I looked at the numbers, right? The reality is that even in '08, with the election that turned out the most voters, we can look at the statistics and see that half the people who could have voted still did not vote. Do they not count? Do we not understand what a protest votes mean? Do we not understand that maybe people, working class people, are maybe have a clearer vision of, again, like what I call the bling bling haze of electoral politics? Right, those are kind of, things that I've been reflecting on, as I start to write more about this experience, right? And I was also thinking about, and I said this to Cynthia, I said, if two men had been running, the response would have been different. Like, let's say had been Ron Fest and Kali Akuno running in 2008. I think the response from the Black and Latino left and progressive people would have been completely different. It might have still been like, y'all are crazy. But you know what? We're going to kind of ride with you a little bit. Or we're going to kind of at least give you some voice. Which then links me to really understand, right? Of course the mainstream media wasn't going to cover me and Cynthia. But when you have Democracy Now! Interview me and Cynthia one time and then interview Ralph Nader in the same election cycle 13 times, I'm kind of questioning Democracy Now! I'm kind of questioning the fact that many so-called progressive magazines, well, I wouldn't call NPR so progressive, but look, for as many interviews that me and Cynthia did with what I would call independent underground media, it was disheartening, particularly not for me running, but for Cynthia, who actually had more experience than anyone running except John McCain, because she was a congresswoman and was in there. It was interesting that, or not interesting, I was like, well, why wouldn't the National Organization for Women and all these kind of liberal groups even just tell people, hey, we're running, we're not even supposed to be involved in electoral politics, and then start me to kind of do the tracing of the money and understanding George Soros's role in the Democratic Party and the nonprofit industrial complex and the mainstream media, but also much of the progressive media that is funded by these sources. Do they really want an oppositional force? I mean, because I could go down from the Nation to the Progressive to In These Times, and I can show you maybe one story that they did on their website the entire time we were running. If it wasn't for that, what we call underground media, hardcore underground media, we wouldn't have gotten any kind of coverage. But with all that being said, people did vote for us, right? And I got to the point, I think maybe last year, I used to make fun and say, oh, we lost by this many votes. And one of my professors, Dr. Turner, when I was at Cornell this past March, said, stop saying that. You didn't lose. Stop saying that. You need to have a radical, and he quoted Robin, radical imagination. We need to do things different even if we fail. Even if the reflection takes 20 to 30 years, the fact was that it wasn't just you and Cynthia running. You were speaking for an oppositional force. And that 1.1 million votes is nothing to sneeze at when we spent less than $500,000 on our campaign. So I know I'm going to wrap up now, I know. So I end with this because I did want to talk, and I hope some of the brothers and sisters, especially Latino brothers and sisters, will bring this up a little bit. This idea of now, how do we formulate a Black racial political consciousness? What does that look like? What does it look like when we expand the notion of talking about black people outside of just sometimes focusing on specifically African Americans? What does it mean to understand a Schomburg and how he influences within the black radical tradition? What does it mean to look at Puerto Rico, right? A colony where we cannot vote for the president, even though you're a United States citizen. But where has some of the greatest social movements in the Caribbean come from? And right now, what's happening on the island of Puerto Rico in terms of organizing and activism has nothing to do with voting. So I look at the struggle for Vieques, 67-year struggle. And it was in May 2003, after 67 years of struggle, that the US Navy was forced out. That was not a vote. That was a people's movement that became an international solidarity movement to get the US Navy to Puerto Rico. Those gates got knocked down. And I'm standing next to Lolita Lebron and Rafael Cansar Miranda, right? So in reflecting in these last 6 years, I think that's what we have to seriously do. And Kali was saying this earlier. We have to now analyze it. But lastly, for young people, let me tell you something. Victories don't come a lot of times. When they do, you got to claim them victories hard. You have to ride with them. You have to even look how the victory could have been better. But we have to at least claim our victories at this moment and have, as what we're all doing now, freedom dreams, freedom now, radical imagination for new times. These are radical times. We're either going to ride radical or we might die by radical elements.
Thank you very much. That was fantastic. So now I guess I want to just throw it open to the audience for questions, comments. Maybe we can take a round of them and then give the panel, maybe take 2 or 3 and then give the panel an opportunity to respond. Yep. Yep. Oh, is there? There's a mic? Is it being recorded? Is that why? Okay. Can you say your, just say your name and where you're from? So.
My name is Mia Henry. I'm from here in Chicago. Cool. I wanted to ask Kali if you could talk a little bit more about the People's Movement Assembly process and how you got people to show up who are not always showing up. Last night, Charlie Cobb talked a little bit about that, gaining the trust of the people that we are trying to organize and work with. And so I really wanted to see how you apply the People's Movement Assembly to that process.
Okay. Can we just get a couple more, and then we'll have the panelists come back. Oh, okay. Yeah.
My name is Dream Hampton from Detroit. My question is for Kali too, and it has to do with the plans to continue the economic plan that you all began with Chokwe, and how, if at all you see it possible.
Okay, one more, and then we'll throw it back.
When the Puerto Rican people voted, most of them voted none of the above. I've never voted in my life. I've always wanted more than politics can deliver. That was true before I was an anarchist. It was almost for us after. If you want, Obama was put in office by the Zionists for Israel, and he is doing his job. Now, if you think in terms of independent politics, it would have to be a politics which is explicitly anti-Zionist on every level, but from precinct on up.
Can you wrap up, please? We've got a lot of people who want to speak, and we've got about 15 minutes left.
Respond to that, please.
Thank you. So, Kali, you had a couple of questions about the campaign.
First, international capital is far larger than Zionists. That's just, one reactionary element or sector of it. And I think we have to note that and be clear about that. Otherwise, we wind up fighting shadows. Number two, in terms of the People's Assembly, we are actually, just quite honestly, looking at rebuilding it. For about 2 years, it really functioned as a campaign, volunteer campaign committee. And so it's really been dormant as a People's Assembly, in my opinion, for this past election cycle. And I think that's one of the, in my personal opinion, that's been one of the mistakes. And there was a brief period, I think starting in November of last year, that it was starting to reorientate itself towards being a People's Assembly and being a vehicle of dual power as we envisioned it. But it wasn't able to fully make that transition back into being that body before Chokwe died, and then a section of it got right back into being that electoral piece for Chokwe Antar. So we are going to have to relearn some lessons, rebuild it in a particular way. But the Assembly piece grew out of a long history that would take me too long to recount. It didn't just evolve with Chokwe's electoral victory in 2009, and it really didn't. It's really started before it kind of took the formal structure it took in 2006, 2005, 2006, as a means of dealing with the forced exodus of folks from the North. That's really clear in its current kind of form and iteration, but it had a history longer than that. So we got to relearn that. There's a lot I can share maybe offline, but we got to relearn some stuff, I think, for it to kind of serve the role that we envision it playing and we know it can play because it's done that, or some elements of it in the past. In terms of the economic piece, we're going full steam ahead with that. And a section of us, quite frankly, we have to assess if it hurt the election or if it helped the election. We still have to do that. But a section of that, myself included, really tried to look in terms of losing Chokwe and not being stuck just in a re-election cycle and anchoring ourselves in what we had kind of set ourselves the task of doing, which was beginning to work to transform the economy, on a local scale to whatever we could do. So we pushed through the conference. We are now head on to Building Cooperation Jackson. I'm turning every stone and corner I can to raise every little penny or inch of that. But the work to actually starting cooperatives is moving forward. We anticipate having 6 up and running by May of next year. So that piece is moving, and folks want to check us out on that level, you can. But that getting back to the basics of us operating as a social movement is what we are really trying to ground ourselves in right now. And should we choose to run Chokwe or somebody else in a couple of years from now, because there's still a possibility he almost won that election, we'll be on a much sounder footing by reorganizing the People's Assembly and setting the pace and creating the vision and platform off of the economic work in terms of building cooperatives than we were before. So we look at it, we're in a better position in many respects than we were in 2009. It's going to be a little bit more challenges, question about that. But in terms of us being clear about what we want to do and where we want to go, we're at least clear on that. I think and understand maybe some things were premature. We're going to concentrate, bunker down here, and move forward from that point. We're clear on that.
Prexy? Can we get a microphone? Got it.
My name is Prexy Nesbitt. I'm from here in Babylon, Chicago. That's what we call it now that we got this mayor named Ram. Y'all have heard about him, I think. I want to ask a question that's very important. Of my 2 colleagues and comrades from here in Chicago that addressed to anybody. When Harold Washington was the mayor here in Chicago, it was a national phenomenon. It was a boat of energy for international. Who said that? That's right. Because you went anywhere in the world, they said, how's Harold? That's what the question was. So it had a real impact. And I think the upcoming election and getting rid of Rahm Emanuel could have a similar impact. And I'd love to have our two colleagues, any of you all, speak to what would be required to have a real people's candidate as opposed to some other pathetic thing where blacks and Latinos get divided, white progressives get divided against blacks, and nothing happens, and this goddamn Rahm comes marching back in with his million-mile set of footlights for all his corporate friends.
You know, I've kind of evolved on the Rahm Emanuel thing, and this is where I've evolved. Rahm Emanuel actually raised money for the second Daley to get in office. Rahm Emanuel is nothing but a continuation of the Daley machine. So as we talk about getting rid of Rahm Emanuel is not the problem. The problem is the machine, the system. So yeah, you can get rid of Rahm Emanuel, that's the easy part. But guess what? You're going to get a Preckwinkle that's going to do the same thing.
Thank you.
And then you're going to get somebody else that's going to do the same thing. And when we talk about Harold Washington, it kind of reminds me of these clashes that Ella Baker and Dr. King used to have. I wasn't around, but I read about it. And, you know, where Ella Baker would say, hey, this patriarchal one man is going to save everybody, and we're still living in the 80s, and me and the brother in the back, we were just talking about how we talk about these revolutionaries, but we stay within the safety of the universities as we do it. We're not getting out there like they got out there. The thing is, Harold didn't do it himself. There are a whole bunch of people running around right now telling the stories about how they made Harold run for mayor. He didn't want to run for mayor. They said, hey man, this is what we need you to do. It's not about one man or one progressive. Everybody has been talking about social movements that push progressive policies, that push the politicians that we want. I really believe we have to stop looking at the one person who was the person saying that they did it. They were the savior. It was the community. Kanye doesn't write all of his records. Rhymefest, GLC, Common. It is a collective of people that write the Kanye records. This is how it works in music. This is how it works in politics. This is how it works in community. You need a collective. Unless we start talking about what we're going to do to have a candidate, Harold Washington means nothing. And you'll never have another one.
Amisha?
Yeah, I mean, actually, Harold's own words were, you need a plan before you need the man, right? Like, he talked about the organizing work, the strategy, the movement, right, that needed to be in place, that was critical to being able to actually have him run for office and win. And I think that's our challenge, right? Is what is our plan? What is our vision and our strategy, and how do we unify across the city on that plan? And I think that the key is really doing deep political education and analysis. And I think the point of I agree. It's when we talk about targeting the mayor, and we do sometimes, right? But we also are very clear that the larger target is the corporate agenda that has created this man. And so unless we're targeting the corporate agenda, we're not going to ever, going after just the mayor isn't going to get us to where we need to get to. So how in our analysis are we talking about that and birthing then a candidate or multiple candidates out of that analysis, that what's needed to move our people forward is a very clear anti-corporate agenda and a very clear people with power agenda. And unless that happens, we're going to continue to be in the same paradigm of having people in office that don't get us to where we need to get to.
And I just want to add, how are we birthing women and supporting women of color running? This is a very male-dominant, electoral politics. Stabby, I'll kill you. Cards, no men. Men. And we see it all the time. I know there are women who want to run. They are afraid, and they kind of should be. Because the violence, whether it's words or actual people saying, I'm coming after you because you're choosing to run or you're not with the Democratic Party or you're doing something very different. How are we birthing a safe space for particularly women of color who want to get a hand into running for electoral politics? I think that's the next level of conversation we are to have if we're reimagining what this thing looks like. And lastly, until we deal with Citizens United, and in 2008, we weren't even dealing with Citizens United and the latest Supreme Court, one that gives individuals unlimited money that they can give. So even from '08 to now, in 6 years, they've locked that down, which is why it won't be $1 billion. It'll be $5-6 billion for the next run. And when our kids, or Alicia's 20, her president will be sponsored by VP, Coca-Cola, American Apparel, Victoria's Secret, whatever, because of the money. So that we have to also, really, young people got to understand that and the impact that Citizens United now has on anyone wanting to run, including local offices. Some local offices or some mayorships in this country can cost upwards to $50 million to run for mayor. So what does that mean? Those are questions we have to also grapple with.
I think I would also add, in terms of the Chicago question that Prexy raised, I think that the Chicago Teachers Union and the teacher strike a couple of years ago gave a model of what a different kind of social movement in this city could look like that had reverberations that went much further beyond the bounds of Chicago itself, because they really took what essentially could have been a bread and butter issue about teachers' salaries and conditions and really turned that into a social movement across Chicago that linked their own particular issues to the right to public education in general, and against what the union termed educational apartheid. And so when many liberal organizations were running away from race, saying that you can't talk about race, the Chicago Teachers Union put racism in public education at the center of their struggle, and it transformed politics in the city, so much so that I know I was surprised when the polls came out around the strike that 70% of the public in Chicago actually supported the strike, and that the only people who were supporting the mayor in that context were like white men making over $100,000 a year. And I think it showed that you don't actually have to run from racism and racial inequality. You can put that at the front and center of these local struggles, and it has a much larger effect. So we have about 8 minutes left. I want to take a last round of hands and then throw it back to the panel. We've got you in the back, you, and then yeah.
Thank you. My name is Renee Hatcher. I'm a staff attorney with the Chicago Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights. And I think what's clear from our conversation here today is that an election can never be a movement within itself. It will never achieve the goals that we're trying to achieve in terms of social change. And one of the things that I think is instructive about Jackson and now in Newark and what's happening is that we can do this. One of the things that I think we have to get back to is we never talk enough about the 1972 Black Political Convention and the fact that there was a national Black agenda that came out of that convention, and there has yet to be follow-up on that, because now we have a lot of minority candidates who don't necessarily feel responsible at all to their communities. But I guess my question is really, what is the first thing that we can do? Because I really think before we do anything around an agenda, around putting candidates forward, is that we need to get the money out of politics and restructure our political system. So what's the first step?
Revolution?
Yeah. I've got this one, and then, yes.
Hi, I'm Brian from Chicago, and I'm part of a campaign to run a socialist alderman in the 25th Ward, Jorge Mujica, and so I think the idea of independent politics is really important. And I think that, I totally agree that we want Rahm out because he's sort of destroying our city, he's closing our schools, he's closing our mental health facilities, Democratic Party. So I wonder when we're thinking about pushing these agendas that he's putting through, closing the schools, privatizing the facilities, all that are things that Democratic mayors are doing in every city in the United States. I think the movements have to say something about that, because I don't want a movement that's going to go out and we're going to sort of try to sort of struggle in the streets and then to say, go home and elect a Democrat who's going to betray us, because they always have betrayed us and they're going to. I think we need independence, and so I wonder sort of how we want to articulate that clearly when we're talking about pushing and imagining things.
My question is for the entire panel, but it was in reference to something Ryan said about space and how we don't live with each other, so it's hard to build movements when you don't live in the same area. I was just wondering how you all overcome that question of space when you use social media, or because like in my life, like all my college friends are all in different cities, so it's just organize any type of movement amongst ourselves unless we use social media. But I find that you need to be in presence with people, and it's a different feeling. So.
And then last one, and then, yeah.
I guess I was looking at the topic regarding in the Obama era and part of the confusion that took place the last time we were mayor up here in Chicago. I think one of the things that why the mayor won in all the black wards, he won every single ward except for one ward. And the reason he won is because that there was a level of real confusion that came from the White House. Because when this man left the White House, he got a major send-off by the president. And there were actually local, I worked on the campaign that, I worked on Carol Mosley Brown's campaign. And we actually had to get that the mayor, the president, was actually robocalling people, not actually endorsing him, but saying how much he thought that was his friend, did a great job. So I think in deconstructing how, you know, what or looking at what the future is, we have to make sure that we have elements that are going to demystify some confusion. And then there was another thing that I'm going to be very honest about. There were a lot of black folks who did not support any black candidate because they were already hooked up with the current mayor, with the then mayor, and thought it was going to be good times rolling, just, you know, one white man for another white man, it just don't matter. And that's what they did. And what they have found out in these past 3 years, this man did not have that in mind at all. And in fact, he told them, whether they were ministers or insiders, I paid y'all. Y'all are done. And I think that those are the underground elements that we've got to look at time.
Okay, I'm going to give the floor back to the panelists. There are about 3 or 4 questions there. So if everybody wants to take a stab at it, we can close the meeting out.
In a particular order?
No, just whoever.
I'm proposing we just go down the line. Well, one thing for the folks in Chicago, and this is a question, not an answer, but it seemed to me that a big part of the Obama agenda has been changing Chicago's place in the international economy. And I haven't heard y'all talk about that, because I think that has an impact on what you can achieve here and how you have to deal with finance capital and its impact on the elections, right? So I can't do doing it back and forth. That's a question. That's just an outside observation. What I can share about one of the questions of where you start in the spatial question, and R looking at, and this R being the Malcolm X Grassroots Movement, the New African People's Organization, we tried to look at where could people power outwork money, and where there were strong enough communities with a long and deep history of social activism that was already in place, right? Not something that we necessarily had to recreate from scratch, you know, that was already present, and where there were intact communities. Jackson is one of those places. So that's why the part of the strategy we use makes sense for Jackson. It don't make no sense for Atlanta. right? And so we got to understand it in terms of where and how we pick our battles and where we think we can win, right? But we got to start with where we have the greatest concentration of forces. You know, that's what I would tell you. And then from there, you can't rely on social media. I don't care if it's Chicago, New York. It's a tool that helps us, but it ain't going to change nobody's opinions. Only one-on-one conversations over time and relationships are going to do that.
Fantastic. Rosa?
Look, I believe that there'll be some local wins and some local communities, but on a national level, until black and brown people can literally detox and withdraw from the addiction of the Democratic Party, I'm going to tell you, there are going to be half the people in this room in 2016 that are going to be tagging me, telling me to vote for Hillary Clinton. I'm going to be like, what the hell is happening again? So for me, I'm at a point, as Rosa, and I don't speak for an organization or whatever, that electoral politics, there's really no hope in it. I'm sorry. Like, because you know what? I have hope in the people. I have hope in social justice. I have hope in movement. I have hope in the millions of undocumented people in this country that are creating and are part of what I think is the most kick-ass social justice movement we got going on right now. And those undocumented people are not talking about voting, are they? Because they can't vote, right? Because they're not citizens, right? I think that's what it means to have of that radical imagination. I think that's what it means to say, let's look and say, it's okay that this experiment has, for the larger part, failed. Can we grab some local victories? Can we change how some cities look? Can we understand cooperative economics? But that's, I think, essentially what we need to do. And to the sister in the back about the National Black Political Convention, look, that was an incredible moment. It was also a very sexist moment. You got to read the record and who spoke and what agenda. And let's look at some of them people that were at the convention.
And the CBC never supported it.
The CBC never, but I mean, Al Sharpton comes out of that, and you know, certain people that may not be for the benefit of our community in the longer run, but also Mary Baraka comes out of that. But I bring up the National Black Political Convention to say this. The National Black Political Convention was the reason some of us went and started the National Hip Hop Political Conventions. 10 years ago, it'll be 10 years in a couple weeks that we were in Newark, right? And why the National Hip Hop Political Convention fell apart, for those that are interested, I can build with you more about it. I always have two things: the sexism within the ranks, but also the split within the people that came at the table. Those who viewed it as a launching platform to their careers, their individualistic wants. Those who viewed it as creating a political agenda for the hip hop community that would not focus on just the tactic of voting, but on movement. And so I think it's important to study these things, but always study them in a gendered way to see if the thing is flawed from the beginning, it might not serve in the long run for what we're looking for.
From what I'm seeing, I don't believe that this is about white versus black, Latino versus black. I don't believe it's about men versus women. I don't think it's a gender issue at all. I believe that the next president is going to be a woman. I believe that the person that they're trying to get to replace Rahm Emanuel is a woman, a black woman. I don't believe that by electing Carol Moseley Braun, anything would have been different, in my personal opinion. I think this is about power versus poverty. I believe that power is trying to keep people in poverty to keep them in power. And power has realized the same way that power realized in the 60s, you know what? It doesn't matter if we give civil rights. It doesn't matter if we let people go to college, because we can stay in power with their money. I think that power has, again, evolved. It was said earlier that white supremacy can have a black face. White supremacy can have a woman's face. White supremacy can have any face that it wants. It's still white supremacy. And I believe that we need to come together and realize that the power, the white supremacy is what we're fighting, not each other. And, you know, in the program that we run in Donda's house, you know, in the election, you know, Rosa and I both had an election. Yours was bigger than mine. But we both lost. We both lost. And she's a woman and I'm a man. Yes, the hip-hop community came to my rescue and helped me raise money. But, you know, it was because of my involvement in the hip-hop community. I believe that, with all, and she knows I love her, but I got to push back. I believe that if McKinney and Lauryn Hill was running, it would have been a different story. If Queen Latifah and Lauryn Hill were running on the Green Party, I believe it would have had more attention and had more support from the hip-hop community. I just believe they wouldn't run because they don't want to upset the power.
And they shouldn't.
And maybe they shouldn't.
Not all rappers are leaders.
I agree with that as well.
Should be rappers.
I agree with that as well. But you know what is interesting is it seems to me everybody wants to be famous. And that's the problem. One of the problems, what I see, a lot of politicians, I have aldermen that come up to me all the time. Yeah, my son rap, I got a rap, man, can you hook me up with... Day after tomorrow, we have the vice president of Def Jam Records coming to this institution to answer questions from the community. You know, thank you, Lisa Lee, for helping us hook that up. But, you know, you would be amazed how many politicians have come up to me like, can I meet him? Can I, you know, I got a nephew. I got a guy that works for Rahm Emanuel. His son is a rapper. And he's like, man, what can I do to push my son's career, Fez? Can you help us? You know, everybody wants to be famous. And we have to get over this attention and being fame and get back into community. Because I believe from being up here and coming back to community is the, I told Kanye the other day, I said, man, if Kim Kardashian ends up dead, that's it for you. That's it. Because you're not rooted in a community that even if you didn't do it, could help you. We have to be rooted in community and stop being consumed with being famous.
I'm going to say something a little different. So I just want to leave with a final note. I mean, I think back to Kanga's point about the Chicago Teachers Union, I do think the fight for public education in the city of Chicago expanded all of our ideas of what's possible about taking back our schools. And I think though we have not yet won in taking back our schools, there's much more that we can tell is possible around taking back our schools. And what are those other moments that we need to create? How do we take advantage and step into the moments that are in front of us to really push this idea of taking back our cities and taking back in particular Chicago? What does that mean and look like, and how do we do that work rooted in and doing transformational change work rooted in individual power, right? Because if an individual does the basic tenets of organizing, right, that I learned early on, that if an individual can't tell that they have power, this idea of collective power action means nothing, right? So what's that work look like at that level to really transform all of the hopelessness and despair that we've been drilled in and drilled down with, right, to change that so that an individual person feels, can tell, believes, is no doubt that they have power. When we do that, then how do we actually do that across communities and across our neighborhoods? But of course it's possible, right? Of course it's possible. None of us would be here if we didn't think that like mass transformation, radical change, all of that was possible. And I think a key part of being able to do that is what's the work that we have to do to decolonize our own minds, right? How have we been hit by sexism and racism and homophobia? What's been the effect on our own minds, right? Because we can have whatever radical revolutionary movements possible, and when we win and we take over and take control, we're still colonized in our minds, and we're going to replicate some fucked up shit in multiple ways, right? And you see this across time and time again. So how do we do the work to do that work across our communities, but how do we anchor that work as individuals to really undo the effects of oppression in our own minds and imagine something completely different for all of us?
I want to thank the panelists again, thank people for coming out, and enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.
I just have a